My brave lad, he sleeps in his faded coat of blue. In a lonely grave alone lies the heart that beats so true. They will find him and know him amongst the good and true, when a robe of white is given for that faded coat of blue. No more the bugle calls the weary one.
Welcome to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. This is Leon Meowser, and we're here to read Under the Maltese Cross, Antietam to Appomattox, the Loyal Uprising in Western Pennsylvania, 1861 to 1865. Campaign's 155th Pennsylvania Regiment. We're going to pick up right where we left off. I haven't been doing this before, but I will be doing it now, which is to say, when we're starting and stopping, I'll let you guys know page numbers, so you know where we're going and where we're not. And this episode, I will include things in the show notes, so actually look at them, because there's going to be a couple of different things that I found pretty interesting so far in some research. So, let's get it going. Review and Dress Parade in Parks. Before General Negley's brigade embarked for Louisville on October 17, 1861, it was arranged to have it publicly reviewed in the West Common and Allegheny, and it was made a memorable and attractive occasion. From surrounding counties of western Pennsylvania's large number of people attended to witness the farewell parade. On this occasion, Governor Curtin, accompanied by his staff in full uniform, presented each regiment with a beautiful stand of colors. The governor made a most eloquent and soul-stirring address. The presentations were in themselves striking object lessons in patriotism, and had a great effect in promoting enlistments. Allegheny County's part in recruiting during the first year of the Civil War, up to the immediate formation of the 155th Regiment, and the other organizations responding to President Lincoln's call of July, 1862, has been described at some length, as far as the limited space allotted permits. Recruited and in Camp Howe at the same time, August 1st, 1862, with the 155th, were the 123rd Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers, commanded by Reverend Colonel John B. Clark of Allegheny City. The 136th Pennsylvania Volunteers, of 10 companies, commanded by the late Colonel Thomas M. Bain. The 139th Pennsylvania Volunteers, recruited by Colonel Frederick H. Collier. Many companies of these regiments, while rendezvousing at Camp Howe, were recruited. However, from the counties of Beaver, Butler, Lawrence, and Allegheny, all these regiments were hurried to the front in time to participate in the Antietam campaign, and each of them suffered very severely and killed and wounded in the Great Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. Recruiting was also very vigorously conducted for the United States Regular Army, both of cavalry and infantry, and many recruits, preferring the artillery and the Marine branch, entered those arms of service. During this period, Allegheny County's quota, through the eagerness shown in enlisting, was the incredibly short space of 30 days, fully furnished the government. Such is, as brief as possible, a review of the times and the events that occurred leading up to the formation of the 155th Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers. Contemporaneously with it was another gallant 3-years regiment, the 139th Pennsylvania, under Colonel Frederick H. Collier, and for many years a judge of Common Pleas Court No. 1 of Allegheny County. The 139th Regiment was but a few days in advance of the 155th at the seat of Army activities, and later wore the 6th Corps badge with pride and glory in all the campaigns of the historic Army of the Potomac. Brevet Colonel William H. Moody, in command of the 139th Pennsylvania Volunteers, was killed at Cold Harbor. The efficient quartermaster of this regiment was the late Captain Samuel Harper. In August 1862, there was also recruited in Allegheny County Company D of the 149th Pennsylvania, Colonel Roy Stone commanding. The officers of this company were Captain James Glenn, First Lieutenant Jacob F. Slagle, Second Lieutenant William M. Dalgish. The latter served on General Reynolds' staff on the first day at Gettysburg. The 149th became later a gallant 5th Corps regiment and formed part of the celebrated Bucktail Brigade. Lieutenant Slagle was promoted to major and became better known in later years as a judge of the Common Pleas Court No. 1 of Allegheny County until his death in 1901. First Union victories celebrated. The early Union victories by Burnside at Roanoke Island and Elizabeth City in North Carolina, in the east, and Forts Henry and Donelson in the west under General Grant, caused great rejoicing and public demonstrations in Pittsburgh and surrounding counties. On the 2nd of February, 1862, Mayor Sawyer directed that 100 guns be fired in honor of the Union victories mentioned. President Lincoln promptly placed General McClellan in command of all the armies of the United States and assigned him the work of organizing and drilling the fresh levies of troops and molding from this material the grand army which he, a year later, on the peninsula and at Antietam, contested in the legions of the Confederacy under its most famous generals. Bitter fruits of the war. The patriotic people of western Pennsylvania, among whom had been recruited and forwarded to the front so many thousands of brave officers and men early in the War of 1862, began to hear ominous tidings from the advance of the Union Army on the peninsula in the campaign against Richmond. The malarious climate had stricken down many youths, and the hospitals were filled and many had died from the same cause. The names of the killed and wounded in the battles and skirmishes following the opening of the campaign were promptly bulletined each day, the lists increasing as the campaign progressed. The battles of Williamsburg, Fair Oaks, Savage Station, Gaines Mill, Malvern Hill, and the Second Bull Run all contributed thousands of names to these lists. Crowds daily surrounded the various newspaper offices, eagerly awaiting the mortality reports. As the central point for western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio at this period, Pittsburgh soon learned that the sights and scenes of suffering and misery produced by the combats in the field would require prompt attention, and that arrangements for the prompt care and comfort of these soldiers would become an imperative duty. Men on crutches from loss of limbs and otherwise maimed and disfigured from wounds in action began to appear in numbers on the streets of the city. Returned soldiers home for treatment of wounds or disease became numerous and required immediate care. Organizations of patriotic men and women, without delay, assumed charge of this charitable work. Soldiers' funerals were also numerous, and not only from the casualties of battle, but also of youth, who, unable to endure the exposures of the field, gave up their lives from disease. Sadness and sorrow filled many homes during that eventful period. Among the most prominent officers who fell in the great battles just enumerated was the gallant Samuel W. Black of the 62nd Regiment of Pennsylvania Volunteers. At the head of his brave regiment in the Battle of Gaines Mill, Colonel Black was killed, his body remaining within the Confederate lines. His remains were recognized by the Confederates, and he was buried in a local cemetery and his grave duly marked. 2 years later, on the advance of Grant's army in the second campaign against Richmond, Colonel Black's burial place was discovered within the Union lines. Under authority of General Grant, who had served in Mexico with Colonel Black, a guard of honor from the 62nd Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers was detailed to accompany the remains to Pittsburgh. An incident out of the ordinary occurred on the disinterment of Colonel Black's body, which seems proper to mention. In the inside pocket of his coat, there was found a small morocco pocketbook in good state of preservation, in which, with memoranda and cards, was found a small photograph of the colonel in the full uniform of his rank and bearing his autograph. The picture was found to be in excellent condition and was turned over to his daughter, Mrs. William J. Moorhead of Pittsburgh, who very kindly favored the committee of the 155th Pennsylvania Volunteers with the privilege of having the same copied and enlarged for the regimental history. Colonel Oliver H. Rippey of the 61st Pennsylvania Regiment fell, like Colonel Black, at the head of his regiment in the Battle of Fair Oaks. He had served in the Mexican War with Colonel Black, and had also practiced with him for years at the Pittsburgh Bar, attaining the front rank in his profession. Colonel Rippey's remains were sent home under a guard of honor from his regiment. The highest honor was paid his memory by the Allegheny County Bar and by the municipality, he having resigned the lucrative office of city solicitor to recruit the 61st Regiment. His remains repose near Colonel Black's in Allegheny Cemetery. Colonel John I. Nevin of Sewickley was among the earliest to respond in April 61 to the calls of President Lincoln. By his efforts, Companies A and G of the 28th Pennsylvania Volunteers was recruited in Sewickley. He was chosen second lieutenant of Company A and reported in Philadelphia to Colonel John W. Geary, commanding the regiment. In February 1862, he, while on duty, was captured and confined in Libby and Salisbury prisons for 6 months. On being exchanged, he organized Independent Battery H and was made captain. Later, he became lieutenant colonel of the 93rd Pennsylvania Volunteers, participating with it in the Gettysburg Campaign under General Sedgwick on July 2, 1863. As lieutenant colonel, he was in command of the regiment, which took a prominent part in the defense of Little Round Top when assaulted by Longstreet's columns. A memorable war meeting. During those early days of the war, party lines had, in the main, vanished. The Union Party was the only party. The third call of the President, which was for 300,000 men, was issued in July 1862. On the 24th of that month, Governor Curtin attended a great war mass meeting held on West Common, Allegheny. Judge William Wilkins presided, and General Thomas M. Howe was chairman of the Committee on Arrangements. Both Judge Wilkins and Governor Curtin made impassioned patriotic speeches. Other eloquent speakers were Judge Wilson McCandless, ex-Governor William F. Johnston, Reverend Dr. Samuel J. Wilson of the Presbyterian Theological Seminary, Judge P.C. Shannon, John H. Hampton, Esquire, Reverend Dr. James Presley, J.J. Sibenick, Esquire, Colonel Francis Felix, and William C. Moreland, Esquire. The number of citizens in attendance at the meeting was estimated at over 15,000, and many speaking stands were erected. Many additional stands for overflow meetings were also constructed and used on the occasion. The speeches were all strong pleas for the Union, and it must be preserved, and that the only way to save it was for the youths of the country to enlist. Never was eloquence more fervid, and never more successful. This was the largest and most imposing demonstration ever witnessed in western Pennsylvania. It had immediate results, and many men and youths present, then and there, decided to enlist. There, the 155th certainly obtained its share. The reported defeat and disaster to the Union armies only stimulated the people to greater efforts and to renewed patriotic responses. Church influence in the war. Church influence of all denominations in those trying days was most actively exerted in patriotic and charitable work in behalf of the soldiers and the Union cause. Prayers were offered in all churches for the success of the Union cause and for the President of the United States. Many ministers also became active in urging enlistments in their congregations, and also in arranging for the care of soldiers' families and for the sick and wounded. Reverend Dr. Howard, pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church of Pittsburgh, Reverend Dr. James Presley, pastor of the Sixth United States, pastor of the Sixth United Presbyterian Church, Reverend John Douglas, D.D. of the Coventer Church, Reverend W.A. Passavant of the Lutheran Church, Reverend Dr. Swift of the United Presbyterian Church of Allegheny, Reverend Dr. Wilson of the Western Theological Seminary, Dr. I.C. Pershing of the Methodist Church, Reverend Dr. John B. Clark of United Presbyterian Church of Allegheny, and all the ministers throughout the two cities and the county were exceedingly active and outspoken in sustaining the President and the Union. Church edifices as well as public buildings had the national flag displayed. Reverend Dennis Kearney, at that date assistant at St. Paul's Cathedral, was an outspoken patriotic Union man. It was by his direction that, within 1 week after the fall of Sumter, a trained steeple climber was brought from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh for the purpose of putting a flag on the cathedral, then the highest spire in the city. The churches of all denominations throughout the county also floated flags from their spires and edifices, thus showing a true union of spirit in the churches of all creeds for the Constitution and the Union. The Right Reverend Michael Dominic, Bishop of the Diocese of Pittsburgh, a native of Spain, in response to President Lincoln's request, went to the court of Spain to assist in thwarting the intrigues of Pierre Soule of Louisiana and other Confederate emissaries in obtaining the recognition by Spain of the Southern Confederacy. Bishop Dominic, who was a man of great learning and of extensive influence, is believed to have been successful on this mission. He received the thanks of President Lincoln, and also that of Secretary of State William H. Seward, for his successful efforts. The prompt action of Bishop Dominic and the manner of urging loyalty and devotion to the Union cause was most gratifying and beneficial in its patriotic lessons to all citizens. On the Sunday following the firing on Sumter, Bishop Dominic ordered read from the pulpits of all of the Catholic churches throughout the diocese an address replete with loyalty and patriotic exhortations in behalf of the Union and its preservation. In St. Paul's Cathedral, the bishop personally read the address and, in addition, expounded the duty of citizens in the prevailing emergency. He particularly reminded naturalized citizens like himself that they had taken oaths of fidelity to the Constitution of the United States, and that the allegiance due by them was as strong as that of those born in the United States, and obligated them equally to rally to the defense of the Union, whether attacked by internal enemies or foreign foes. Pointing to the dome of the cathedral, the bishop eloquently appealed to heaven and prayed fervently that victory would be granted against those attempting to succeed in the great rebellion against the Union. His earnestness and zeal in the Union cause united his clergy and people on the side of law and order, and induced thousands of the followers of his faith in the Diocese of Pittsburgh to volunteer in defense of the Union. The Pittsburgh Subsistence Committee. As the gateway between the Great West and Northwest and Washington City, D.C., Pittsburgh early in the war felt the importance of an organized system of some kind to afford relief to the vast numbers of soldiers passing through the city, both going to and returning from the front. Railroad trains and steamboats transporting troops were often unavoidably delayed en route, and the soldiers, having exhausted their rations, frequently arrived in the city without food, and were often compelled to make the entire journey to the scene of army activities fasting. About the last days of July 1861, the late B.F. Jones of the firm Jones & Lawlin, passing along the Liberty Street one morning, noticed a train of soldiers standing on the tracks of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. The men, having been started from their camp without rations of any kind, and being locked in the coaches, were clamoring to get out to procure something to eat. Not many minutes elapsed before Mr. Jones had purchased the entire stock of apples and crackers of a neighboring grocery store and had them distributed among the soldiers to satisfy their pressing wants. No active step was taken towards effecting an organization to provide relief for such cases until Tuesday, August 3rd, 1861. The arrival in the city about midnight on Saturday, a few days previous of July 24th, 1861, of the 24th Ohio Regiment, weary and hungry with no means of relief in a land of plenty, emphasized the necessity of speedy action towards forming an association for the assistance of such cases. On Sunday morning, this regiment was marched to the railroad station, where, standing in line, they were served by a number of patriotic citizens, with ham, bread, and coffee. On Tuesday, August 3rd, 1861, a public meeting was held, and the Pittsburgh Subsistence Committee was organized with the following executive committee and members. Executive Committee: William P. Wayman, Chairman Joseph Albry, Henry M. Atwood, Dr. Andrew Fleming, Medical Director. Members. And there's a lot of members on here, so we're going to keep it short. This is on page, 32. We're going to go with Miss Alice Kennedy, Miss Sidney Lemon, Miss Mary Moorhead, and Mrs. G.O.B. Edwards. The duties of this committee were to provide for the subsistence of such companies and regiments as were in process of recruiting in the city until they were regularly mustered into the United States service, and to supply transient wants of soldiers passing through the city. To serve the purpose, the committee rented the old Leach Warehouse, corner of Penn and Wayne, now 10th Streets, and fitted up the same with dining room and kitchen sufficient for the accommodation of an entire regiment at one time. On the next Sunday morning, August 8th, 1861, 1 week from the time the 24th Ohio Regiment was fed, the 20th Indiana Regiment, en route to the front, was marched to the newly furnished quarters and given a breakfast consisting of ham, bread, and butter, and coffee by the Pittsburgh Subsistence Committee. On all incoming through trains, the committee distributed a circular inviting sick and wounded soldiers to avail themselves of the means of assistance furnished by the committee. Many other regiments, and companies were taken care of in the old Leach warehouse until October of the same year, when city councils granted the free use of the City Hall, then one of the largest and finest buildings in the county, for this purpose, and the headquarters of the committee was transferred to it. On the main floor of the hall were placed 10 long tables, sufficient for the accommodation of 1,200 soldiers at one meal. Dr. Andrew Fleming, a leading physician of the city, took charge of the medical department, and under his supervision an adjoining room was fitted up as a hospital, where the sick and wounded soldiers might receive the best medical attention, in addition to the many little delicacies that often do more good than medicine. Talking about alcohol. Here, the subsistence work was carried on with renewed diligence, the committee entering earnestly and heartedly into the work of supplying the wants of the brave defenders of the Union. No appeal was made to the public for funds, with a single exception that when the treasury was empty at one time, a call was made by the committee upon the banks and businessmen, who responded most liberally. From that time, the public voluntarily contributed so freely that the treasury was never exhausted. Among the most liberal contributors of the funds of the Subsistence Committee was the late William Thaw, whose open purse helped out the committee in oft-occurring emergencies. It was found by experience that owing to the distance of City Hall from the railroad station, many soldiers who arrived by one train and departed by the next could not avail themselves of the hospitality of the committee. To obviate this disadvantage, on July 18, 1862, the second floor of the warehouse at 347 Liberty Street, opposite the station, was fitted up as soldiers' quarters and called the Soldiers' Home, meals being furnished here day and night. Upon one occasion, the railroad having given notice a few hours in advance, 30 members of the Subsistence Committee fed 5,000 soldiers in 12 hours. The walls of Old City Hall contained 2 memorable tablets, one bearing this inscription: Pittsburgh Subsistence Committee, organized August 1861, dissolved January 1866, sustained by voluntary subscription of the citizens. On the other inscription, 409,745 soldiers entertained in this hall, 79,460 sick and wounded provided for at the Soldiers' Home, total 489,205. The Pittsburgh Subsistence Committee needs no other record to speak to posterity. The Christian Commission. The Western Pennsylvania branch of the Christian Commission was organized April 6, 1863, and relieved the Pittsburgh Subsistence Committee of all its duties except that of providing refreshments and medical attendance for all regiments, companies, or individual soldiers passing through the city and to from the seat of war. On the date above mentioned, the Subsistence Committee transferred all its hospital and medical stores to the Army branch of the Christian Commission, and the latter at once became active in collecting and distributing supplies for sick and wounded soldiers. At a meeting of the ministers of the various denominations of Pittsburgh and vicinity, held in the Second Presbyterian Church, April 6, 1863, the Army Committee of Western Pennsylvania was organized, and the following officers elected: President Reverend Herrick Johnson, Chairman of Executive Committee; Honorable Robert McKnight, Secretary; Robert C. Totten, Treasurer; Joseph Albry, Receivers; William B. Wayman, John R. McCoon, Joseph Horn, Henry W. Atwood, General Committee; Reverend William D. Howard; Reverend S. J. Wilson; Reverend William Preston; Reverend William Snively; Reverend Geo. S. Chase; Reverend I. C. Pershing; Reverend H. H. Higby; Reverend S. Stewart; Reverend E. E. Swift; Reverend C. E. Swope; Reverend W. J. Reed; Reverend Reuben Hill; Reverend J. D. Herr; Honorable J. K. Moorhead; Harvey Childs; B. Wolfe, Jr., Joseph McKnight; G. Follansby; James McCandless; Charles Arbuthnot; J. G. Backofen; and Robert H. Davis. On the evening of April 16, 1863, the first public meeting was held, and from that date the new committee began active work in connection with the United States Christian Commission. In 1864, Mr. Albry took the title of Field Secretary, and William Frew became Treasurer. A band of patriotic men and women had been trained to the work. The previous work of the Subsistence Committee had been so remarkably efficient that its transfer of this part of its duties to the Christian Commission secured for the latter a corresponding confidence and influence. To the noble devotion of Messrs. Albry and Wayman belongs no small portion of the credit for the grand record which the Pittsburgh branch of the Christian Commission presents. The field of operations of the Commission included western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and West Virginia. Local committees were everywhere organized, and the entire territory was thoroughly and systematically canvassed. The press and transportation companies placed their facilities at the disposal of the Commission and were immensely helpful to the noble cause. The Pittsburgh branch of the Christian Commission was associated with those auxiliaries of the United States Christian Commission whose field of work was with the armies of the Southwest, having their principal depot at Nashville. Considering the fact that the immense work carried on by the Commission was entirely gratuitous, no salaries being paid, its success was remarkable. The annual increase in the amount of stores received was about fivefold, in addition to cash receipts of $158,334.37, stores were collected to the value of $679,664.89. Cash value of all receipts, $837,999.26. This magnificent showing was in excess of any other branch of the United States Christian Commission. The total cash value of supplies collected by the Pittsburgh branch of the Christian Commission was only a little less than that collected by the central office. The total expense for collecting and forwarding the large receipts of the Pittsburgh Auxiliary was only $3,787.35. During the later years of the war, the various conferences and presbyteries in the Home Field Commission, at their own expense, kept delegates at the front, cooperating with the government in caring for sick and wounded soldiers and ministering to the comfort of the troops generally. Felix R. Brunot. Honorable Felix R. Brunot, a distinguished citizen of Pennsylvania, past the age of military service, early volunteered as an organizer of the United States Christian Commission to visit the Army camp hospitals to relieve the many sick and wounded requiring care and attention. While Mr. Brunot was engaged on this duty on the peninsula with General McClellan's army, the great 7 days battles before Richmond occurred, and the Confederates captured in many thousand Union soldiers and many thousand more of the badly wounded and sick in the field hospitals also fell into the enemy's hands. Together with the surgeons, nurses, hospital attendants, and members of the United States Christian Commission. Mr. Brunot was taken to Libby Prison, the Confederates declining to recognize him as a non-combatant entitled by military law to immunity from imprisonment. Mr. Brunot in Libby Prison was invited by the Confederate authorities to visit Secretary Stanton in Washington to secure a modification of the existing orders prohibiting the introduction of medical supplies to any part of the Confederacy. The unexpectedly large number of federal wounded and sick prisoners captured found the Confederates wholly unprepared for their care, and their condition appealed strongly to the sympathies of Mr. Brunot. He accepted the mission to Washington. His appeal and request for the suspension of the existing military orders was refused by Secretary of War Stanton. Mr. Brunot was urged in Washington not to return to Richmond to resume imprisonment in Libby. The plea was made to him that he was a non-combatant, entitled by usages of war to immunity from imprisonment. These urgent appeals of personal friends were not entertained. Mr. Brunot, asserting that he had given his parole of honor to return within the Confederate lines, and that no mere personal discomfort would justify in dishonoring his parole, he accordingly returned to Richmond and delivered his answer to the Confederate authorities of his failure to secure from the federal government the medical supplies solicited for the suffering, wounded, and sick Union soldier prisoners. Few more chivalrous incidences of exemplary honor during the Civil War is to be found than illustrated by the conduct of Mr. Brunot on this occasion. The Confederate authorities, unable to provide for the unprecedented large number of wounded and sick Union prisoners, soon after the return of Mr. Brunot from Washington, paroled all the wounded and sick, and included him in the exchange. As an officer of the Christian Commission, Mr. Brunot resumed his duties and attentions to the care of the returned prisoners in camp and to the soldiers in field hospitals. Mr. Brunot continued until the close of the war most active in the work of the United States Christian Commission and later to the United States Sanitary Commission in its great field of labor on the field with the Union armies. Dr. Thomas Dixon, one of the three brothers, eminent surgeons of that name, practicing in Pittsburgh, and all of whom left their home patients in the first battles of the war, contracted typhoid fever while serving with the United States Christian Commission in the camps of McClellan's army besieging Richmond. Dr. Thomas Dixon, one of the three brothers, eminent surgeons of that name, practicing in Pittsburgh, and of all of whom left their home patients in the first battles of the war, contracted typhoid fever while serving with the United States Christian Commission in the camps of McClellan's army besieging Richmond, and fell a martyr to that disease. His two brothers, Doctors John and Joseph Dixon, were serving with him at the time and continued to respond with their personal attendance and services to call for volunteer surgeons on every great battlefield of the Army of the Potomac until the end of the war. Women's work in the war. The valuable and devoted services of the women of Pittsburgh to the soldiers in the field and in the hospitals cannot be too highly extolled. They exhibited a consecration to the work of humanity that is sacred and beautiful beyond words. Also, among the first to tender their services to the government as nurses were the Sisters of Mercy of Allegheny County. They soothed many a fevered brow and watched the glorious young life ebb from many a patriot youth. Their 4 years' work at the West Penn Hospital during the war is part of Pittsburgh's patriotic history. Their lives today, many a white-haired man who cherishes in memory a choicest casket the tender recollection of a gentle, loving, kind-faced Sister of Mercy in somber robe who was ever at his bedside when his life trembled in the balance. No sooner were the Union soldiers victims to the missiles of the enemy or prostrated by the many camp diseases than a corps of trained and experienced nurses of that day, the ladies composing the Sisters of Mercy of the Diocese of Pittsburgh, tendered their services to the government of the United States to go to any place where the sick or wounded required attention. President Lincoln, in a grateful letter to Bishop Dominic, returned his thanks and at once accepted this kind offer. The government, which had taken possession of the West Penn Hospital of Pittsburgh, with Dr. James King as surgeon in charge, at once turned over the entire management and conduct of the institution to the Sisters of Mercy and to the corps of surgeons of whom Dr. King was chief, who had so heartily endorsed their qualifications. Their services were continued from early in the war until long after its conclusion. During those 4 years, many thousands of Union soldiers, badly wounded and afflicted, became patients under the charge of these sisters. The development of the war and the great battles following required an increase of hospital accommodations in Washington, and a second draft upon the Sisters of Mercy of Pittsburgh was made by Secretary of War Stanton, and they were placed in charge of the new Stanton Hospital, Washington City, probably the largest institution for wounded soldiers in that city. A score or more of Pittsburgh's Sisters of Mercy served faithfully and devotedly there throughout the war. Under the supervision of the Christian Commission, the first low-diet kitchen in connection with military hospitals was established by a Pittsburgh lady, Miss Mary Moorhead, in the Cumberland Military Hospital at Nashville, Tennessee. This kitchen was maintained about 2 years, feeding during that period from 1,000 to 1,500 patients. Of the 106 ladies commissioned for the work in these low-diet kitchens, 13 were from Pittsburgh and vicinity, namely Miss Mary E. Moorhead, Miss Ellen R. Murdoch, Miss Hannah Shaw, Miss Hetty Lathrop, Miss Mary A. Little, Miss Mattie J. Fowler, Miss Mary Humford, Miss Emily Hunnings, Miss Maggie Hopper, Miss Phoebe Neese, Miss Mary Hunnings, Miss Lizzie DeHaven, and Miss Howells. Among these ladies thus devoted to the Union cause, none were more distinguished for zeal and self-sacrifice and charitable work in the hospitals of the Union armies than Miss Ellen R. Murdoch, now Mrs. Ellen Murdoch Watson. In this field of work of Miss Mary E. Moorhead and the volunteer ladies' assistance, the Commission was enabled to accomplish prompt and efficient relief for the soldiers through her father, the Honorable James K. Moorhead, one of the most influential congressmen during Lincoln's entire administration, and an intimate personal friend of Secretary of War Stanton. These Pittsburgh ladies, mentioned above, also set up a low-diet kitchen at White House Landing during General McClellan's Peninsula campaign. Mrs. Watson, quoting from her interesting diary, says that, being attracted on one occasion by the spectacle of a steamer coming down the James River from Richmond under a flag of truce, they were astonished and delighted to see their townsman, Honorable Felix R. Brunot, step ashore from the steamer, having been released from his imprisonment by the Confederate government, together with thousands of paroled prisoners of war. It is due to the memory of an esteemed and worthy lady of Pittsburgh to mention the name of Mrs. Kate Savage, lately deceased, whose husband, the late John Savage, was a proprietor during the war of a hostelry known as the American Hotel on Liberty and Grant Streets, and immediately parallel the old Pennsylvania Railroad passenger station at Liberty and Grant Streets, since replaced with the Union Station. Trains from the east and west, almost daily bearing regiments and companies, as well as individual soldiers on furlough, came into the station at all hours, and particularly during the night, many being sick or wounded, and all hungry. The late Hunt M. Butler, Union Depot master during the Civil War, in a card to the Pittsburgh newspapers, wrote a just tribute to the patriotic zeal and affectionate solicitude shown throughout the war by this good lady. To the soldiers sick and wounded, without pay or reward of any kind to his knowledge, Mr. Butler says she furnished meals and lodging and assisted many a poor, distressed, wearied, and often penniless soldier passing through the city. She cooperated in every way with the zeal and charity of the ladies of the Pittsburgh Subsistence Committee in numberless cases. It often occurred that exhausted and stricken soldiers, broken down by the long ride on the cars, were unable to walk or be conveyed to the bountiful table provided in Old City Hall for soldiers, or even to the soldiers' home, and in such cases, Mrs. Savage and her servants would carry food and refreshments to them in the cars. Mr. Butler, who was a daily witness to these benefactions, so cheerfully and gratuitously rendered the soldiers by Mrs. Savage, all without ostentation or display of any kind, urged that a permanent tribute to commemorate her deeds of charity to the soldier should be made in Pittsburgh's war history. An instance of wounded soldiers being cared for far from home and far from the battlefield where they fell is recorded in the fact that 70 of the wounded from the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing were brought to Pittsburgh by a hospital steamer and cared for and tenderly nursed by the loving women of the loyal city of Pittsburgh. First Soldiers, Orphans' Home. The mortalities, casualties, and sufferings incident to the Civil War found the state of Pennsylvania unprepared with her many other pressing obligations during the first years of the continuance of the war to provide homes and quarters for the many orphan children of soldiers throughout the Commonwealth. The private homes, hospitals, and orphan asylums of the various religious denominations were wholly inadequate. To assign those unfortunate soldiers' orphan children to the county poorhouse was not to be thought of. To Colonel James P. Barr of Pittsburgh is due the distinction of being the first to display a practical interest and devotion to the soldiers' orphans by his establishing in Pittsburgh the first Soldiers' Orphans' Home, located on Bluff and Stevenson Streets. This school was opened early in 1861 and continued to be maintained throughout the years of the Civil War and after until the year 1867, when the state of Pennsylvania established the system of state orphans' homes and schools in all parts of the state. There were sheltered and provided for in the Pittsburgh Soldiers' Orphans' Home, founded by Colonel Barr, upwards of 1,000 children of soldiers who fell in battle or died of disease, contracted in the military service. The matron of this home was Miss Mary J. Stafford, a native of Pittsburgh, selected for possessing the peculiar sympathetic qualities and patriotic devotion to the welfare of the wards placed under her charge. Colonel Barr, although at the head of a great daily newspaper during this period, which made great demands upon his time, manifested great personal interest in the development and maintenance of the school, which was supported wholly by the generosity of himself and a few other public-spirited citizens of Pittsburgh. During the continuance of this orphan's home, the patriotic founder, to reside closer and to be more readily a visit and superintend the institution, removed from a remote part of the city to a dwelling next door to the home. Patriotism, 1861-1862. The foregoing pages, comprising the introductory chapter of this history from Sumter to Appomattox, constitutes a brief review of the rapidly transpiring events of 1861 and 1862 in western Pennsylvania. To this is added the names and records of citizens and tributes proper to preserve the memory of those heroic patriots, who so promptly, unselfishingly, and unremittingly sacrificed their time and their means so liberally in sustaining the government of the United States in the great crisis of the Civil War. They rose above partisanship in their zeal for the Union cause, disdained personal benefit or profit arising from the necessities of the government, in vivid contrast with the prevailing commercialism of the present times. Without exception, no grander galaxy of loyal, disinterested, public-spirited, and true men than the 100 citizens composing the Committee of Public Safety could be found in any other country. Nor was the loyalty, philanthropy, and zeal manifested by the citizens named in this chapter deserving of any greater acknowledgement or gratitude than that of the ladies who so promptly rallied to the relief of the sick and wounded soldiers on the field, in the hospitals, and in their journeys to and from the seat of war. With such conspicuous and preserving examples of loyalty and patriotism of the citizens of western Pennsylvania, it is not strange that the younger generation of youths composing the 155th Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers, on their enlistment, should have been imbued with the same noble principles and desires to spare no sacrifices in defending the Union. Alrighty, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there for today, as that was a lot to cover, a little bit longer than normal, but that's okay. So I wrote down, I don't have a lot of notes, not for these beginning pre-regimental stories kind of thing, so I just wanted to go over a couple of things to talk about with you guys. I know this episode's a little bit longer than normal, but I just wanted to finish it all up before we got into the meaty part of the book. This is the last part. In the very beginning, they briefly cover, they have the big send-off ceremony for the regiments, for General Negley. And they had the governor come out in a big parade. So it was a brigade that was leaving, and a regiment consists of 10 companies of 100 men. So there's 1,000 men per brigade. And anywhere between 2 and 6, generally around 4 regiments exist in a brigade at this time period. And so I can imagine there's probably 4,000 or 5,000 men on this field, with the whole city turning out to send them off, with the governor there to hand out colors. Now those colors consist of the American flag, and generally a flag that was created for the regiment. It was usually handmade. At this point in time, they were all handmade, right? So the colors have become incredibly important to these regiments, because it doesn't only just represent the regiment, but also the home and state that the men are from. And since flag bearers are always targets in combat, in one battle, sometimes between like 5 and 10 men would fall holding on to the flag, and then somebody else would just drop the rifle, pick up the next one, and pick up the flag. As we get into more stories in this book, you'll see kind of how that works. I know in the Battle of Gettysburg, there was a Minnesota regiment that was told to stop a brigade all by itself, and they charged across an open field, took horrendous casualties, but did take a flag that belonged to a Virginia regiment. And Virginia still wants that flag back, and Minnesota won't give it to them, which I think is fair. Let's see. So Colonel Samuel W. Black, we heard about him. He's on page 25. I'm going to put a link to this book in the bottom so you can take a look at his picture. In fact, all of the pictures, just flipping through them and looking at them, is pretty interesting. It's a lot of pictures of the people that I've talked about so far. In regards to the section called The Bitter Fruits of War and talking about disease, at this point in time, there's like literally 4 people on the planet that know what germs are, or think they know what germs are. It's a totally foreign concept. In fact, it's not even a concept that's been taught to all of these farm boys and city dwellers. Germ theory, as we understand it, where we wash our hands after we eat and that kind of thing, doesn't really get accepted mainstream until about 1890. It's about 30 years from now. So the medical profession, as we know it today, is very much in its infancy during the Civil War, which is why you see doctors just having, an entire mountain of limbs that they're cutting off because of wounds, and they're not cleaning their tools in between. This is kind of like our last war for the United States where that happens. But in the end, veterans show off their wounds with pride. So you'll see a lot of photos with Civil War veterans where they show you their legs or their stomachs, wherever they got shot, maybe in the chest or the arm and they survived, or maybe their arm is gone. They show those off in those pictures because they're very proud of them. Page 28 mentioned troop exchanges, and we have come across that a couple of times. This is still happening. Essentially, they would just trade an equal amount of soldiers. You have 1,000, I have 1,000 kind of deal. You have a colonel, I have a colonel, let's trade them. You have a general, I have 5 colonels, let's trade them. That keeps going all the way up until General Grant becomes general of the armies, and then he stops it altogether because he knows the Confederacy needs more troops than the Union does. So in the beginning, when troops are captured, they'll end up back in the regiment, and then towards the end of the war, they'll get captured and they won't get released. They'll be sent to semi-permanent prisons. The Subsistence Committee and Christian Commission I thought was really interesting because these are like the bearers or the forefathers of the Red Cross and also the USO, or the United Service Organization, which is what troops use today. There's about 250 centers around the world. If you're ever in an airport and you come across one, you can just stop in and be like, hey, I've always wanted to see one of these. Check them out. They're essentially what the Christian Commission, the Subsistence Committee, are all about. A place to sleep, a place to eat, a place to rest, and it's just for troops. So they're generally quiet. Also, I wanted to talk very briefly about Felix R. Brunot. Ask yourself, listener, would you voluntarily go back into a prison knowing that the people who run it don't have the medical supplies to take care of you and the food capacity to feed you? Because that's what he knew and that's what he did. And I'm not sure I would do the same, you know what I mean? I think I just might happen to stay out of prison. I would like that. I also wanted to bring up Dr. Thomas Dixon dying of typhoid fever. And typhoid and diseases at this time frame last a lot longer than they kind of do now because you can seek medical help and get treatment. Back then, that's not too much of an option. So typhoid, untreated, can last 3 days or as long as 4 weeks. It's why you wash your hands before you eat and after you go to the bathroom, because if your food and water gets contaminated with feces, that's what happens to you. So, and you see a lot of soldiers in this war die from easily preventable diseases that we understand now, but back then they just didn't have the capacity to. That is all I wrote down for today. Let's see. Next week, we're actually going to begin with Chapter 1. We're finally there. I can't wait. I'm so excited. It's labeled The Regimental Itinerary, Chapter 1, The President's Call for 300,000 Men. And it finally consists of the formation of the 155th Regiment. Finally there. Thank you for listening to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the American Civil War. If you'd like to contact me, I do have an email that is warofrebellion@gmail.com. You can also check out my rebellionstories.com website, although it just has a lot of the basic information. But if you want to keep looking for any additional information as things move forward, that's where I'll post it. Other than that, have a fantastic week, everyone, and I will catch you next week on War of the Rebellion.
In a lonely grave alone lies the heart that beats so true. They will find him and know him amongst the good and true, when a robe of white is given for that faded coat of blue. No more the bugle calls the weary one. Rest, noble spirit, in thy grave alone. They will find you and know you amongst the good and true. When a robe of white is given for that faded coat of blue. He cried, give me water and just one little crumb, and my mother, she will bless you through all the years to come. Go tell my sweet sister, so gentle, good and true, that I'll meet her up in heaven in my faded coat of blue. No more the bugle calls the weary one. Rest, noble spirit, in thy grave alone. They will find you and know you amongst the good and true. When a robe of white is given for that faded